There is a village on an island off the northwest coast of Scotland where the last 36 inhabitants packed their belongings, boarded a boat, and asked the British government to take them away. They never came back. The houses they left are still standing. Their tools are still in the fields. Their church is still there. And the question of why an entire community that had lived on this island for thousands of years chose, in August 1930, to simply leave has an official answer that does not quite cover everything the documents show. In this video, we are counting down 13 abandoned UK villages where the explanation does not add up, where the official record does not tell the full story, or where the reason everyone left is simply not known. Not the villages that were flooded by reservoirs or cleared by the military, those stories have been told. The villages where the departure itself is the mystery. Where the community was there, and then it was not, and nobody left a note that fully explains why. Stay with me to the end, because number one is a village that has been empty for over 300 years, where the last residents left in the middle of a night no one has ever adequately explained, and where the physical evidence of what was left behind suggests something happened so suddenly that there was no time to take anything. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's begin. On the night of the 26th of January, 1917, a storm surge struck the village of Hallsands on the South Devon coast and destroyed it. By the following morning, most of the village had been washed into the sea. 29 houses were destroyed, the community was rendered homeless, the residents were evacuated and never returned. What makes Hallsands significant in this list is not the storm, it is what caused the storm to be so catastrophically destructive. In the 1890s, the Admiralty had contracted a company to dredge shingle from Skara Brae, the bay on which Hallsands stood, to provide material for the expansion of the naval dockyard at Devonport. The residents of Hallsands had objected. They had petitioned. They had warned that removing the shingle beach that protected the village would expose it to the full force of the sea. The Board of Trade had investigated and concluded that the dredging could continue. The dredging company removed approximately 650,000 tons of shingle from the beach. By 1900, the beach level had dropped by nearly 4 meters. The houses of Hallsands were now directly exposed to the sea in a way they had never been before. The warning the residents had given was correct. It took 17 years for the sea to deliver the consequence they had predicted. When the storm came in January 1917, there was no beach left to absorb it. The village was destroyed. The government paid compensation. The compensation was inadequate. One resident, Ella Trout, refused to leave and continued to live in the one remaining intact cottage for the rest of her life. The dredging company was never prosecuted. The Board of Trade officials who overruled the residents' objections were never held accountable. The sea took what the dredging had left exposed, and the people of Hallsands watched it go. In the Yorkshire Wolds, about 6 miles southeast of Malton, the earthwork remains of one of England's best-known medieval deserted villages occupy a dry valley beside a stream. Wharram Percy was inhabited from at least the Iron Age. By the medieval period, it was a functioning village with a church, a mill, 2 manor houses, and a population of perhaps 150 people. By the end of the 15th century, it was empty. The church fell into ruin. The houses collapsed into the earthwork platforms that are still visible today. Wharram Percy is the most extensively excavated, deserted medieval village in England and has been the subject of archaeological investigation since the 1950s. That investigation has produced an enormous amount of information about what life in the village was like. It has produced considerably less certainty about why the village was abandoned. The accepted explanation for most deserted medieval villages is the Black Death of 1348, which killed between a third and a half of England's population and left many settlements too depleted to continue. Wharram Percy's population appears to have survived the initial plague years, only to decline slowly over the following century. A second explanation involves enclosure, the conversion of arable land to sheep pasture that was more profitable for landlords and required fewer workers. Documentary evidence from Wharram Percy suggests that the Hilton family, who held the manor in the late 15th century, were actively enclosing land and reducing the tenant population. The last reference to inhabitants in the village is from 1517. By that date, the community that had been there for 2,000 years was gone. Whether it left or was pushed, whether the enclosure was gradual or sudden, and what the final moments of the community felt like for the people who experienced them is something the archaeology cannot fully tell us. Tyneham in Dorset was covered in this channel's video on UK towns the government erased from the map, but there is a dimension of the Tyneham story that the main account did not address. When the residents of Tyneham were evacuated in December 1943, they were told they were leaving to allow American troops to train for the Normandy landings. This is documented and accurate. What is less often discussed is the specific military use that Tyneham's farmland and buildings were put to in the years after the war, when the army retained the land despite the residents' expectation of return. Declassified documents obtained under Freedom of Information requests in the early 2000s revealed that sections of the Tyneham estate were used for experimental work relating to chemical weapon dispersal testing in the period. Immediately after the Second World War, the nature and extent of this testing, the specific agents used, and whether any contamination remains in the soil of the former village has never been made public in full. The Ministry of Defence has declined to provide a comprehensive account of what took place on the Tyneham land between 1945 and the 1950s. The residents who asked to return were told the land was needed for training. Some of what the land was actually needed for was different from training. The village is open to visitors on most weekends. The interpretation panels describe the wartime evacuation and the community that left. They do not describe what the land was used for in the years when the community was waiting to return. On the west coast of mainland Orkney, in a bay called the Bay of Skyle, the remains of a Neolithic village have been preserved beneath a sand dune for nearly 5,000 years. Skara Brae was inhabited for approximately 600 years, from around 3,180 BC to 2,500 BC. It was a sophisticated settlement. Stone furniture, drainage systems, interconnected houses, evidence of a complex social structure, and then it was abandoned. Not gradually, in the way that settlements normally decline. The archaeological evidence suggests a departure that was rapid, possibly sudden, and that left behind things that the inhabitants would normally have taken: stone bowls, beads, tools. The evidence of daily life, left as if the community stepped out and did not return. The reason for the abandonment is not known. Theories include climate change, a catastrophic storm, disease, social collapse, or a ritual decision to leave. None of these theories is supported by direct evidence sufficient to be conclusive. What is known is that the community at Skara Brae was thriving, that it built a settlement of remarkable sophistication for its period, and that it left suddenly enough that the possessions of daily life were abandoned in place. The sand covered the village, no one returned. The storm of 1850 that exposed the site again revealed a settlement so complete that it is described as the Scottish Pompeii. The people who built it and abandoned it left no account of why they went. The stone furniture is still in place, the hearths are still there. The village is exactly as they left it, except for the 5,000 years that have passed since they did. Imber in Wiltshire was discussed in this channel's video on towns the government erased, but Imber was not the only settlement consumed by the military expansion of Salisbury Plain. Between the 1890s and the Second World War, the military acquisition of land on Salisbury Plain resulted in the depopulation of a cluster of villages and farms across a much wider area than the Imber story alone covers. The villages of Chitton, Tilshead, and the farms of the Imber Range area lost population across decades as the military progressively restricted access to surrounding land, acquired farms through compulsory purchase, and made the continuation of agricultural life in the area impractical. Some of these departures were documented, some were not. What is consistent across the area is the pattern. Communities that had been present on Salisbury Plain since the Domesday Book slowly losing their economic rationale as the military transformed the surrounding land from an agricultural landscape into a training area. The specific decisions about which farms were purchased, which families were given what notice, and what provision was made for communities whose livelihoods were removed by the military's expansion are documented inconsistently in the archives of the War Office, the Ministry of Defence, and the local councils whose areas were affected. The full account of how many people left Salisbury Plain because of military expansion and what they were compensated and what they were not has never been compiled in a single accessible document. In the medieval period, Dunwich on the Suffolk coast was one of the most important ports in England. It had a cathedral, multiple churches, a mint, 2 hospitals, a Franciscan friary, a Dominican friary, and a substantial commercial port. It was among the largest towns in England. Today, Dunwich is a small village of a few hundred people with a single pub, a small museum, and a beach. The medieval city is not there because it fell gradually into the sea across several centuries of coastal erosion. Entire parishes were lost in single storms. The cathedral was lost. The churches were lost one by one, their bells heard by people who said that on still nights you could hear them still ringing beneath the waves. The last of the medieval churches, All Saints, collapsed into the sea in 1919. The last gravestone slid from the cliff in 1990. What makes Dunwich significant for this video is not the erosion itself. It is the question of why the erosion was allowed to proceed without intervention when intervention at various points in the city's decline might have been possible. Medieval Dunwich petitioned repeatedly for help with its harbour, which was being silted up by the same coastal processes that were eating the cliffs. The help did not come. The town that had been one of the most important ports in England was allowed to fall into the sea. Today, the beach below the cliffs of Dunwich is used by divers who explore the medieval ruins in the shallow water. On very low tides, masonry is visible at the waterline. The city is still there, it is just not where it used to be. And hey, before we reach the stories that have no explanation at all, if this video is showing you a Britain that the guidebooks and the heritage organisations have never quite presented in full, hit the like button and share it with someone who thinks they know this country. Because what follows is the part of this list where the departures stop having even partial explanations. Now, let's continue. On the 30th of August, 1930, the 36 remaining inhabitants of St Kilda, a remote archipelago 50 miles west of the Outer Hebrides in the Atlantic Ocean, signed a petition requesting evacuation from their island and resettlement on the Scottish mainland. They were evacuated 2 days later. They took their dogs, their furniture, and their livestock. They left everything else. The houses are still standing. The clytes, the stone storage structures that the St Kildans used to dry and store food, still dot the hillsides. The street of the village, known as Main Street, is still there. The inhabitants never returned to live there permanently. The official explanation for the evacuation is straightforward. The island's population had declined to a point where the community was no longer viable. The last nurse, the last teacher, the last young men who could manage the island's boats had left in the years before 1930. The remaining 36 were elderly or very young. They were dependent on a supply boat that did not always come. In the winter of 1929, a young woman died of appendicitis that could not be treated on the island and would have been treatable on the mainland. The community decided it could not continue, but the longer history of St Kilda raises questions that the 1930 evacuation story does not fully answer. The British government had been aware of St Kilda's decline for decades. The island had been a source of tourism income for the steamship companies that ran excursions to it from the 1870s onward. The tourists came, took photographs, bought souvenirs, watched the islanders perform their traditional practices, and left. The government provided minimal support. The infrastructure that might have made the community viable, a proper harbour, reliable communications, adequate medical provision, was never built. Whether the St Kildans were evacuated because the community had declined to the point of non-viability or whether the community declined to the point of non-viability because it was never given the support that might have prevented that decline, is a question that the evacuation story, as typically told, does not address. Between the 1750s and the 1850s, the Highland clearances transformed the landscape of northern Scotland. Landlords replaced tenant farming communities with sheep, which were more profitable. The communities were moved, sometimes by persuasion, often by force, to coastal strips where they were expected to take up fishing, to Canadian and Australian emigration schemes, or simply removed without provision for where they would go. The traces of the cleared villages are visible across the Highland landscape as earthwork remains, as roofless stone walls in moorland settings, as place names on maps that correspond to no surviving settlement. What belongs in this video is not the clearances themselves, which are well documented, but the specific villages where the departure was so complete and so rapid that the physical evidence of daily life was simply left in place. Bad Bea in Caithness, a village built on a clifftop so exposed that children and animals had to be tethered to prevent them being blown into the sea, was cleared in 1911 when the last families emigrated to New Zealand. The houses are still there. Garanin in Lewis, a black house village restored as a heritage site, preserves the architecture of cleared Highland communities. But across the Highlands, many cleared village sites have never been formally excavated or interpreted. The earthwork remains of communities that were displaced across a century of clearances lie in open moorland, visible to anyone who knows what to look for, interpreted to no one. The people who were in these places, the families that built the walls and worked the land and were then moved, emigrated, or died, are not memorialized at the sites they built. They are in Canada. They are in Australia. They are in New Zealand. They are in the Highland graveyards. But they are not on the land their walls still mark. This channel covered Capel Celyn in the video on towns the government erased. But the Tryron Valley was not the only Welsh community drowned to supply English cities with water. Across Wales, in the decades of reservoir construction that ran from the 1880s to the 1960s, over a dozen Welsh valleys were flooded to create reservoirs for Birmingham, Liverpool, Bristol, and other English cities. The village of Nantgwilt in the Elan Valley was flooded in 1893 when the Elan Valley reservoirs were constructed to supply Birmingham. The community had no vote on the matter. They received compensation. They left. The ruins of the drowned village, including the church of Nantgwilt, are occasionally visible at the shoreline during drought years when the reservoir levels drop. The Clairwen Reservoir, built in the same valley in 1952, flooded additional farmland and forced the movement of further farming families. The specific history of each family displaced by Welsh reservoir construction, the terms they were offered, the alternatives they were or were not given, and the question of how a devolved Wales might have handled these decisions differently from a Westminster government has never been the subject of a comprehensive inquiry. What happened in Wales across those decades, the repeated subordination of Welsh communities to English water supply needs without adequate democratic recourse, is a pattern that Capel Celyn represents most dramatically, but does not represent alone. Between the 1960s and the 1990s, the coalfield communities of County Durham experienced a process of systematic closure that did not begin with the pit closures of the Thatcher era, but had been underway since the beaching cuts and the NCB's rationalisation programmes of the 1960s. What resulted in the most extreme cases was the complete abandonment of specific settlements, not gradually through demographic decline, but through the deliberate removal of housing stock by the local authorities who owned it. The Durham County Council categorised settlements as Category D in its planning framework of the 1950s and 1960s, meaning that they were designated for gradual rundown rather than investment. Residents were not immediately told to leave, but investment in their communities stopped. Schools closed, shops closed, the houses were not maintained. As families moved away, the houses were demolished rather than reoccupied. Some communities survived this process, others did not. The villages of Old Wingate and Ludworth in County Durham are among the settlements that were effectively removed through the Category D designation. Their residents were not forcibly evicted, but found themselves living in communities from which all investment had been withdrawn, in houses that were being demolished around them, in a landscape from which the economic rationale had been systematically removed. The Category D policy was abolished in 1970 when it was recognized as excessively destructive. The communities that had been Category D designations for the previous 2 decades did not recover. The earthwork traces of demolished colliery housing, the street patterns visible in the overgrown former village sites, are the record of a policy that removed communities not by force but by the withdrawal of the conditions that made community life possible. Gruinard Island was covered in this channel's first UK video as a site contaminated by Second World War biological weapons testing. But what belongs in this abandoned villages list is a specific element that the earlier coverage did not address: the community that was present on Gruinard before the government took it. Gruinard Island was not uninhabited when it was requisitioned in 1942. It had been farmed. The family that owned and farmed the island was required to leave before the anthrax tests were conducted. The island was requisitioned from them. They were paid £500, the same amount paid at the end of the decontamination in 1990. The farming life that had been on Gruinard before the war, the specific relationship between a family, an island, and an agricultural practice, was ended by the decision to use the island as a testing site. The island has never been reoccupied as a farm. The decontamination declared the surface safe. The farming community that was there before the tests has not returned. What was there before the anthrax? The specific agricultural community that the government requisitioned away is a part of the Gruinard story that is not told in the heritage accounts of the island or in the documentation released by the Ministry of Defence. The island that was used for biological weapons testing was not an empty island. It was someone's farm. And after the testing ended and the decontamination was declared complete, no one went back to farm it. Most deserted medieval villages were abandoned because of plague, enclosure, or climate. Nether Stowey in Somerset presents a different and less common phenomenon: a village that moved. The original medieval settlement of Nether Stowey was not in the location of the present village. It occupied a site approximately half a mile from where the current village stands. At some point in the medieval period, the entire community appears to have relocated to its current position. The reasons for this movement are not clearly documented. The earthwork remains of the original settlement are visible in the fields above the current village. Theories include a decision to relocate closer to a new road, an improvement in the water supply at the current location, or the initiative of a specific landowner who had reasons for preferring the community to be elsewhere. What makes Nether Stowey unusual is that the movement appears to have been voluntary, organised, and complete, leaving the original site entirely abandoned while the community continued in its new location. This is not a departure from the area. It is a departure from one specific place to another. But the original site is abandoned in exactly the same physical way as a community that simply ceased to exist. The earthworks are there, the house platforms are visible, the original street pattern is readable. And the reason the community chose to pick up and move half a mile is not, after 8 centuries, definitively established. On the northeast coast of England, in the County Durham coastal area, there are references in medieval documents to a settlement called Hartness. It appears in the historical record as a functioning community in the early medieval period. By the end of the medieval period, it is gone. Not from the records, because the records end. Gone because the community itself ended. No documentary evidence explains why. There is no plague record that accounts for it. There is no enclosure order. There is no flood record. There is no fire record. There is no record of any event that would account for the disappearance of an entire settlement from the northeast coast. Archaeological work has located what are believed to be the remains of the Hartness settlement beneath the coastal dunes in the area south of Hartlepool. The site has not been fully excavated. The physical evidence that has been recovered is consistent with a functioning medieval community. It is not consistent with a community that was destroyed by any identifiable single event. The departure from Hartness was, as far as the available evidence suggests, voluntary. The community left. They did not leave because of a plague, because of an enclosure, because of a flood, because of a fire. They left because they chose to, or because something happened that no record preserved. After centuries of examination, the question of why everyone left Hartness has not been answered. The dunes cover whatever remains of the answer. The sea is not far away. And the community that was there and then was not there has left no account of why.